Hey guys, it's Chris at Highline Guitars. You're watching another one of my YouTube guitar building videos. If you're new to my channel, welcome. I hope that by the end of this video, I'll have earned your subscription. And of course, everyone else who's watching out there, if you enjoy this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up. That always helps. And if you'd like to help to support the channel financially while getting something in return, you know the drill. Head over to my eGuitar Plans website. There's a link in the description below. Or you can visit my YouTube merch shelf, which is displayed below the description for this video. So what I'm going to be talking about today is part 13 of my V-shaped guitar build. In the last episode, part 12, I had installed the neck and did a few other little details, some coarse sanding and drilled some holes and such. But what I'm going to be doing in this episode is I'm going to prep the body and get it ready for paint. And what that means is I need to put a grain sealer on the surface, and I'm going to be using Solarez, I can't believe it's not lacquer, grain sealer for this. And what that's going to do is it's going to help prepare the body, as well as it kind of hardens the wood a little bit. So let's head out to the shop and get started. The first step in prepping the body is going to involve masking off the neck from the body where the neck meets the body. And the reason I'm doing this is because I'm going to be applying a grain filling sanding sealer to the body, and I don't need to apply that to the neck because the neck is made of maple, which is a dense enough wood that it doesn't really require any kind of a grain sealer. The wood that I use for the body is alder, and alder has somewhat of an open pore structure. It's not as significant or as extreme as some other types of wood like mahogany and especially ash, but it still has enough of an open pore structure that when you apply paint to it, it will soak into those pores and the grain and texture will telegraph up through the finish. So I want to apply a grain filling sanding sealer in order to help fill those the grain in the pores so that that paint won't soak in. Also, alder is, even though it's classified as a hardwood, it's one of the softest hardwoods there is. It's almost as soft as pine. So I'm going to be using a sanding sealer which will actually harden on the surface of the wood. So it will offer a degree of protection that I otherwise wouldn't have if I were to use just an ordinary sanding sealer. Before I can apply the grain filling sanding sealer that I'm going to use, I need to make sure that the surface of the wood is as clean as possible. Vacuuming it and blowing it off with my compressor isn't enough to get the surface as clean as I can get it. So I'm just going to wipe it down with some isopropyl alcohol just to remove any last traces of dust. And because the alcohol will temporarily darken the wood, it helps me to see any flaws that I might have missed when I was sanding previously. Now, as I mentioned in a previous episode of this build, I had done some initial sanding of the body as well as the neck using 150 grit sandpaper to remove some of the tool marks and scratches that were left over from the CNC carving process. And this is as far as I need to go at this stage, because later on, after I've applied the grain filling sanding sealer, I'll do a lot more sanding to get the surface really smooth before I start applying the paint. But for now, 150 is enough to get the surface where I need it to be. And plus that allows me to get that initial sanding done a lot faster than if I were to work through a lot of different grits. So like I said, I'll stop at 150 and I'll go from there. The product that I'm going to be using to fill the grain and pores on the surface and get the surface ready for paint is Solarez, I can't believe it's not lacquer, grain filling sealer. And the reason why I use this product is because I don't have to wait around for a long period of time to let the product dry and cure before I move on to sanding and preparing the surface for paint. I simply brush it on, and once it has been fully applied to the surface, I can then cure it. And the process of curing simply involves exposing it to sunlight. And the sun will trigger the curing process. And that'll take place over a period of about 30 seconds to a couple of minutes. And of course, a lot depends on how bright the sun is where you are, and whether there's any cloud cover or obstructions. I find that because I live at 5,280 feet where the oxygen is a little bit thinner, this product will cure really super fast. We're talking literally 30 seconds of exposure to the sunlight. So that means I can apply a coat, cure it, sand it, and then apply a second, and then repeat the process and even apply a third if I wanted to. And I can do all this within about an hour's time. So it's incredibly fast to work with, and it does a great job of filling grain so that I can get a nice smooth surface to apply the paint to. Now, literally within minutes of applying the sanding sealer and curing it in the sunlight, I'm ready to start the final steps of sanding the surface in preparation to get the body ready for paint. And I'm using 220 grit sandpaper here, which I've wrapped around. It's one of those giant erasers that you can find often at your dollar discount stores. You can also find them online. I think you can get them on Amazon. At any rate, these things work great because they'll conform to the surface. And if the surface that you're sanding has any sort of curved contours, they work great for that because they'll curve to that shape. But what my goal here is to get this surface as absolutely smooth and flat as possible. And that means I'm going to have to probably do some sanding and then apply additional coats of the sanding sealer and continue sanding until I have a perfectly smooth, uniform surface. If it isn't perfectly smooth and uniform, when I go to apply the paint, that's going to be really noticeable, especially when you're using a solid, darker color. And in this case, I'm going to be painting it a flat black, so it's going to have to be absolutely perfect surface before I start to paint it. Even though I'm sanding on a downdraft table, I still have to periodically stop and wipe off the surface with a paper towel to remove some of that sanding dust, because it does adhere to the surface of the wood, and the downdraft table isn't going to pull that away. What the downdraft table does mostly is suck down the airborne dust particles that are floating in the air. And even though I am using a downdraft table, I still like to wear a dust mask, because dust is just not a good thing to be breathing in, especially if you do this work frequently. Typically, I'll apply 2, maybe 3 coats of the Solarez, I can't believe it's not lacquer grain sealer, onto a guitar body, although it depends on the species of wood. If I was applying it to a mahogany body, 3 to 4 coats may be required. If I was doing ash, it may be 5, maybe even 6 coats to get the grain completely filled. But in this case with the alder, I can probably get away with 2, maybe 3 coats. Again, like I said before, the goal is going to be to get that surface as absolutely flat and smooth as I possibly can before I proceed with applying my primer and paint later on. Curing with sunlight works great, especially where I live, but it doesn't work for everybody. You can, however, use UV lights to do the curing, and I'll post a link in the description below to the Solarez website, and there you can check out the products, but you can also learn what type of lighting systems work best for curing if you don't have a good, reliable source of bright, unobstructed sunlight. And like I said, because I'm at a high altitude, that lack of oxygen does help to promote a rapid cure. And in my case, it cures completely in just minutes. This is what the surface of the guitar looks like after a couple of coats of the Solarez I Can't Believe It's Not Lacquer grain sealer. As you can see, it's not super smooth, and there are some dust spots and little specks and things like that, but that's okay, because next what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the final sanding with 220 grit to get the surface ready for paint. Earlier I was using that giant rubber eraser as my sanding block, and that's because it will rapidly level the surface, but it won't do so as accurately because the rubber eraser is flexible and somewhat spongy. To get a truly perfect surface, especially with flat surfaces like this guitar has, I'm going to use a hard wooden block with my 220 grit sandpaper to get the surface level. This way the block doesn't conform to the inconsistencies in the surface. Instead, it's going to grind down the high spots until they're level with the low spots, giving a perfectly flat surface. And the way this works is, as I'm sanding, I can see the surface getting flat. In terms of its sheen, it starts to look matte and dull. However, wherever there are low spots, those stay darker and shiny. So what my goal is as I'm sanding is to remove all those darker shiny spots and leave the entire surface a consistent matte sheen. Then I know I have my surface perfectly level. And since I used a wooden sanding block, I know that once the guitar has been painted, the surface is going to look smooth without any unsightly waviness or lumpy texture. Now, even though I'm using a Ster-8 no-load sandpaper, it's still going to clog up with sanding dust. So I keep a big piece of scrap carpet nearby that I can wipe off the sandpaper to clean it before I continue sanding the surface. Now, obviously, I'm not going to paint the fretboard, so I need to mask it off. And since I'm going to paint the guitar flat black and the fretboard is black, what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply the masking tape so that a small sliver of the fretboard is still visible. That's going to get hit with some of the paint. The reason for that is because later on, after I have painted the guitar, there's going to be a line that you can actually feel between the paint and the fretboard where I masked it off. And obviously we don't want that line because you would feel it as you're playing the guitar. So what I'll do is I will, once the paint has been applied and has been allowed to dry and cure, I'll remove that masking tape and then I will lightly sand that line, that ridge that's going to form there until it blends with the fretboard. Of course, I can't forget to mask off the shelf where the Floyd Rose nut is going to sit. I don't want any paint to get on there. If I were to paint that area, I know that somebody watching the video will comment that that paint is probably going to somehow affect the tone and sustain of the guitar. And even though I know that's not true, I don't want to deal with it. Now at this stage, the guitar is ready for primer and paint, which is going to happen in the next episode. But there is one other thing I need to do before I proceed with painting the guitar, and that is I need to drill a couple of holes to route the wiring of the guitar. And I want to do that now because if I do it later, after the guitar has been painted, there's always a chance that I could damage the paint. So I want to try and get as much of this type of work done now before I paint it. That way I protect the paint as I'm doing my final assembly later on. Okay guys, well that's all the time I've got for this episode. In part 14, I'm going to apply the primer, the paint, and the clear coat, and I'll walk you through the whole process that I'm going to follow to do this. It's going to be kind of interesting because this guitar is going to be a flat black color, and flat black colors have a way of really showing flaws in the surface. So it's critically important that the surface, as I just demonstrated in this episode, be perfectly prepared. If it's not, I'll have quite a bit of work to do to try to get it to that stage. So be sure to check out episode 14. It's gonna be a lot of fun. And again, if you're new to the channel, welcome. I hope you've enjoyed this episode and will consider subscribing. And to everybody else, at the very least, give me a thumbs up. It'll always help promote the videos and will keep me making more videos in the future. So until the next episode, as always, take care, stay safe, and I hope you'll be back for episode 14.